like to work for the sake of the work.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Courting Saskatchewan, and I'm the event coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. Tonight's event is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. Special hello to anyone joining us through the live stream from home. And for those of you who are here in person, thank you for joining us as well. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of I Never Met a Rattlesnake I Didn't Like by David Carpenter. Thank you to David for being here tonight. I'd also like to thank Thistledown Press and especially June Lee and Elizabeth Phillips for working with us to create this event. Elizabeth joins us tonight and will introduce our very special guest host for the evening, Dave Margoshes. Please give Elizabeth a warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to this very special launch of the title that I think is the best title we've ever published.
Forget about the rest of the book.
The title rocks. But it's only the tip of the iceberg. I'd just like to take a moment to thank Thistledown's funders, Sask Arts, Canada Council for the Arts, and the Government of Canada's funding program, the Canada Book Fund. And thanks to McNally Robinson for hosting. And now I get to introduce Dave Margoshes, a rare and special pleasure. Dave.
Which one is he?
Dave is a Saskatoon area poet and fiction writer. Most of his adult life has been in Western Canada, for 35 years in Saskatchewan. It seems like longer, but he's published 20 books of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. His work has appeared widely in Canadian literary magazines and anthologies, an active member of the literary community in Saskatchewan and beyond. He's served on a number of boards, and I noticed he's mostly been vice president, which shows a lot of wisdom, not ever being president, and been writer in resident in Saskatoon and Winnipeg. And he's mentored a number of younger writers and has served on several literary juries.
Hello.
And not surprisingly, and this is the big news, after all that I've mentioned, he has just been chosen as the 2022 Lieutenant Governor's Lifetime Achievement Award in my Saskatoon. What do I do with this?
Oh, hi.
Comments throughout.
So this is the first event of my second lifetime. So I'm here to introduce my good friend David Carpenter. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah,
How about now?
No.
Is it on? How about now? It's my task, my pleasant task to introduce my good friend David Carpenter. David really doesn't need much introduction. He is one of Saskatoon's most famous, most prominent authors, Saskatchewan's most famous authors. He's published short stories, novels, nonfiction, poetry, won numerous awards, including Book of the Year at the Saskatchewan Book Awards a few years ago for his nonfiction title, A Hunter's Confession. And he's also won the prestigious Kloppenberg Award. And his former employers at the University of Saskatchewan gave him an honorary doctorate a few years ago. And probably half the people in this room were students of his. He was a professor at the university. So I'm not going to say any more about him. He's a terrific writer, and his new book is very terrific. Please welcome David Carpenter.
Thank you, Margot. I just want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. Those of you who haven't noticed, there's a large cardboard box at the back of the room there, and please don't touch it, okay? Do not touch the cardboard box. No, there's no cardboard.
Put the snake in a bag.
I forgot where I put it. All my life, I've been really crazy about wildlife. My parents took my brother and I camping all over the place because they were too cheap to buy a motel room for the night. But we saw lots of bush. My dad taught us, my mother and father taught me how to fish, and I never thought that I would ever write about it, especially a memoir about wildlife. But I was going through my archive and going through, I have about that many writer's notebooks, and I was looking for something, and I couldn't really find it, but I kept seeing these little anecdotes about animals, and I finally realized just at the start of the pandemic that I really like this stuff, and there must be a book in here somewhere. And you guys, there's lots of chairs over there. Anyway, at the start of the pandemic, I started writing, and all that time shut up inside the house was a great time for me. It was a really joyful thing to write. I'd like to read for a little while, and then I'm going to be interrogated by the fearful presence behind me. So I'll read parts of a few chapters. This chapter called The Good Bug, and it starts with me wearing a belly boat. It's an inner tube with neoprene waders and big frog flippers, and you not only look frog-like, you look pregnant in them. On this day in June, the weather was muggy and warm. Skies were turbulent, the wind capricious, the clouds alternately fleeting or threatening. The horseflies and mosquitoes and their vicious squadrons were everywhere. So as usual, I doused my exposed parts with the rankest of mosquito sprays, foolishly tossed the canister into the car, and churned my belly boat towards the deep water. The clouds returned, and a prolonged roar of thunder exploded over my head. Not a thunderclap, but a thunder barrage, as though God were grumbling once more about the human race. Cautiously moving my fins, I kept within 50 meters from shore, just in case. The rain came slanting down, washing the mosquito spray from my face and hands. Because I'd left the damn spray container behind in the car, the mosquitoes went straight for me. Waving them off with little success, I tried to keep on fishing, and to complicate matters, the fish weren't biting. And the mosquitoes were trying to bleed me dry. I noticed a small commotion on the surface of the pond. I flapped my fins towards the spot and discovered a huge dragonfly floundering on the water. It had been likely caught in the downdraft from the perilous winds, and now it was drowning. I reached out and lowered my hand to scoop it up for closer examination. Before I could get my hand under the limp insect, it suddenly came to life, seized one of my fingers, and climbed onto my hand. A glistening dark alien, black and bronze with blue patches all the way up the fuselage. And I do mean fuselage. This dragonfly was almost 8 centimeters long, a giant winged raider in its own buggy habitat. Its wingspan was wider than my hand, and its eyes were enormous. I tried to ease the dragonfly from me to the float tube, but it clung to my hand like a rescued cat for another minute or so. Then slowly it crawled onto the warm surface of my belly boat. And there we were, two floaters on the pond of life. Little simile there. The rain had stopped and the sun returned. In the presence of this wondrous great bug, I had forgotten all about fishing. I was caught in some kind of spell brought on by this biplane with enormous opalescent eyes. It was a lake darner, the biggest species of dragonfly in the entire boreal forest. And a small miracle immediately unfolded as the darner dried its wings in the sun. The mosquitoes had all disappeared. Even the horseflies had vanished. Some of you readers will already know that no other creature in nature, with the possible exception of bats, has such an appetite for mosquitoes and flies, black flies, deer flies, horse flies, and hornets. If we just look at mosquito mortality, we discover that one hungry darner can consume hundreds of mosquitoes in one day. Up north, in bog and fen country, you can walk around a mosquito-infested marsh, and if the dragonflies are out hawking, the enemy bugs will vanish. You don't even need fly spray. Because of the charming monster riding along at my left hand, the enemy squadrons decided to retreat and torture other creatures, including my friends near shore. This analysis of mine is just guessing, of course, but it's an educated guess. I haven't yet since then tested my theory by leaving my bug spray behind. Perhaps my faith in dragonflies is not absolute. But that day on my float tube, the insects that sought my blood kept veering off into safer territory. The fishing was lousy, but my new companion and I were enjoying the sun. Its wings were drying, and its tail seemed to be twitching with pleasure. Pleasure. How anthropomorphic of me. But something was happening here, something that I will never prove. I was apparently having some sort of relationship with this formidable bug. I had saved it from drowning, it had saved me from the dreaded mosquitoes and horseflies. We were traveling together symbiotically in quiet creaturehood. If at this moment the fish had begun to bite, I would probably have ascribed this good luck to the magical powers of my traveling companion. My albatross, my fierce angel. But on that day, the fish had something else on their minds. Still, as I gazed ever so cautiously at the glistening, tricolored body next to my elbow, the compound eyes, the undulating blue-striped tail, the huge paired wings, the signs of its recovering strength, and the acquiescent attitude of its presence on my float tube, I was helpless not to ascribe something to it, something beyond mere bugness. My symbolic traveling companion, my fellow voyager, the comrade that I would try to describe to my wife when I got home. I was resisting, of course, the fanciful temptation to call this mere insect, this thing with the face of an alien invader, my angel. Then I stopped resisting. This supersized bug had become my official candidate for the angelic. And just as the thought emerged, there was a whir of wings and the darner flew away. It didn't just fly, it rattled through the air like a marine helicopter. Let's say that you are me with all my delusions intact. You are driving home to a cabin on a small 2-lane highway. It's a long stretch. You're tired and you're driving too fast. It's a warm evening and the little highway ahead is dotted with what look like broken twigs. But as you come closer, the twigs fly up at your approach. They fly up by the dozens, giant dragonflies basking in the late afternoon sun, taking in the warmth of the asphalt. Several of them crash into your windshield, and too late, you are reminded of your bug-eyed friend on the float tube of 1 hour ago. What do? Keep on driving as fast as you can? Or do you slow down to allow the battalion of warriors to fly out of harm's way? The sun will soon be setting. In boreal forest country, you don't like driving in the dark and you don't want to get home late. Your partner is waiting. What do you do, O ancient mariner? What do you do? my wife Honor has many talents, and one of them is getting me out of my study where when I'm trying to write the great Canadian novel or else a reasonable Saskatchewan novel. And it happens in March and she'll have a kind of lost look on her face. And one time it was, let's go to Arizona. And I said, why Arizona? And she said, because when I lived there, I never got to do any hiking. And I believe I even faked a yawn. And then she said something that brought me to attention. She said, there's rattlesnakes there. At this time of the year, they're all over the place. You find them on the hiking trails. And she had me. I abandoned what would have been the greatest novel you've ever read. And to Arizona, we did go. We drove as far as Tucson. We were heading for southern Arizona near the Mexican border. And in Tucson, we purchased some books on hiking trails and wildlife. When it was Keever's turn to drive, I read my way through southeastern Arizona, binging on spiders and insects. Tarantulas were apparently harmless. In another book, Venomous Animals of Arizona, I had the neatest reading. I thought it was wonderful reading. I discovered that the tiniest of scorpions were not harmless. In yet another book, I read that the emergency procedures for getting bitten by scorpions, Gila monsters, spiders, wasps, and coral snakes always ended with the same advice: transport victim to medical facility. But what if you were camping as we were way off in the mountains? You may wonder why I wasn't reading up on rattlesnakes. Truth was, I felt I knew enough about them already. I just wanted to see one. And I realized by this time that spotting a rattler in the wilds might require a lot of luck. So perhaps if I immersed myself in other species, I could broaden my expectations, thereby tempering my disappointment in case the rattlers failed to show. For a change of pace, I turned to roadrunners, scarlet tanagers, and coppery-tailed trogons. We were not far from the Mexican border when I checked my insect guide for locusts. I remembered from something I had read as a boy that they could remain underground as nymphs for as long as 17 years and then suddenly emerge by the billions and destroy all the crops for hundreds of miles. My knowledge of locusts was perhaps more biblical than entomological, but our Arizona Critters book revealed to me that there were such things as 13 and 17-year cicadas down there. So I hoped to see some. Apparently, they emitted a high whining sound, so we were likely to hear them at the very least. Armed with these factoids, ready for my first coral snake, my first Gila monster, my first tarantula, I set out with Keever on our first hike in Arizona. We were camped in the Chiricahua Mountains and had discovered a game trail that led uphill into a narrow, craggy gulch. We toiled up this rough trail for 2 or 3 kilometers, and the only wildlife we encountered were dozens of small lizards. We heard a sound, a high cheering call from the rocks along the trail ahead. A cicada was beckoning me. I got down on my knees, nose to the ground like a true bug sleuth, and peered around rocks. Near a rounded rock beside the trail, about twice the size of a stone hammer, I heard the cicada again, very close to where I was crouched. I peeked around the rock, and not far from my nose lay a rattlesnake, coiled to strike. I don't remember, sorry. I don't remember standing up or jumping back. I simply found myself panting and still crouching, but a good 6 feet from the rattler. It's a very small snake, perhaps only 30 centimeters, and light brown with a twin set of spots down its back. Its rattle was a tiny affair that emitted a sound like that of an insect. The region in my brain where words issue had become wordless. All that remained was a giant neon sign saying, "Wow." As we continued, I get even more articulate as I go along. As we continued along the game trail, the brush cactus had thinned out and the drop to our left became steep. What had been a hill to climb was abundant flora. With abundant flora became a drier ecosystem. And everywhere in the crumbling wall to our right, there were crevices for the lizards to hide in. We were walking up through a beautiful remnant of what once was a mountain. As the sun began to approach the horizon, we came upon another rattler, this one basking right out in the open, over a precipitous drop to our left. It too was light brown and had the same pattern of twin spots down its back, but it was much a larger snake, almost a meter in length. It was warming itself in the late afternoon sun and had what looked like a small swelling in the middle of its body, a recent meal, perhaps a lizard. Snakes like to lie in the sun after a meal, which is part of their digestion regimen. To put it mildly, I was very excited. 2 rattlesnakes, and I thought the thrill would never leave me. The sun was setting when we started back to a campground. Darkness fell quickly. Knowing as I did that this was a typical hunting time for rattlers, this last half hour on the trail was a little nerve-wracking for us. I don't recommend nocturnal hiking in this terrain. The following morning, we had an enthusiastic conversation with a park biologist from Texas. When we described our 2 rattlers to her, the young woman's face brightened. "You 2 are very lucky," she declared. "Those were twin-spotted rattlers and they are very rare." The words gladdened me. At that moment, I realized we had arrived in a place far from home where, to some people, rattlesnakes were good news. On another day during the same road trip, still in Arizona, we were heading towards some windblown mountains crowned with pine trees. Keever was driving along a small highway and decided to take a shortcut down a steep gravel road. "Are you sure?" I said. "Why not?" she said. It was that kind of a holiday. Down we plunged over the white-hot gravel, clattering over axle-busting rocks. Towards the bottom of the incline, I finally exhaled. "Well," said Keever, "that wasn't so bad." I was about to disagree with her when I spied, could it be, a big, thick snake gliding slowly over the road, and owing to its great size, it was unmistakably the Tyson Fury of rattlesnakes, a western diamondback. It was so much bigger than our 2 twin-spotted rattlers that it made them seem like worms. I got out of the car and proceeded cautiously towards the snake. More people have died from the bites inflicted by the western diamondback rattlesnake than any other snake in North America. The eastern diamondbacks are slightly larger and even more dangerous, but their numbers have declined into endangered level in their traditional habitats, the American South. You can hear the sadness in my voice when I talk about declines in rattlesnake populations. The western diamondback, however, continues to prevail in small pockets throughout the Southwest. It is still the most common rattler in the entire country. It has relatively long fangs for its size and a prodigious amount of venom in its glands. Occasionally, they can be aggressive if threatened. As I approached, the rattler continued to poke along. It crawled off the gravel road towards some clumps of sagebrush and cactus. It moved very slowly, as though to make a point. The toughest, surliest lout in the bar. When I'm in cougar country, and Kidder and I quite frequently are in cougar country, I get the same story from the locals. I'll complain. "Well, I haven't seen a cougar around here. I've been here for a week and I haven't seen one." And they always say, "You never see them, but they always see you." And I always want to say, "Well, how do I know they've seen me if I haven't seen one?" But I think the locals are sometimes right. I'm telling you this in preparation for my next story, whose plot points are punctuated by paw prints. This happened on an April morning in 2018, when Keever and I were hiking with our Saskatoon friends, Donna Rose, and Ian Dowell. We had chosen a West Coast trail that took us from a rainforest to a high rocky promontory. As we plodded through the forest, I noticed a tiny stream running parallel to our path. Near the stream and beside the path were some muddy and sandy patches, great places to spot tracks of the local fauna. That day, I found a few deer prints, but nary a sign of a cougar. Ian asked me what I was looking for. There had been some rain the night before. Therefore, many of the tracks I spotted in these open patches were recent. But like I say, nary a cougar. Donna asked me what I was looking for. Keever answered both of them. He's looking for cougar tracks. Really? Said Donna with mock skepticism. Further into the forest, I found a gorgeous muddy patch with no tracks of any kind. This unmarked muddy patch happened to be where the path forked. The right fork wound out of the forest and up into the rocky promontory with a remarkable view of the terrain below and the ocean beyond, a perfect place to stop. After a lively lunch, we headed back down the same patch. By force of habit, I once again checked the same trackless, muddy patch. What are you looking for? Said Donna. What are you looking for? Said Ian. Keever got down on hands and knees and delivered the verdict. How could you have missed this one? I didn't miss it, I said. As we stood there staring at a perfect cougar track, we may have come to the same realization. Above us was the trail towards the ridge where we had eaten our lunch. The imprint of the animal's paw was pointed in that direction. So our recent visitor must have given us at least a sniff or a glance. Needless to say, this was the freshest cougar track I have ever seen. There are lots of cougar stories in this book for those of you who like cougar stories. It's a club in town, I think. This last story takes place in Jasper. I'm reading so that the animals get bigger and bigger. So the end of the book is really scary. My first encounter with grizzly bears was in the summer of 1962, when national parks were still using outdoor garbage dumps for the disposal of human food waste. The phrase habituated bear was not yet in common parlance. In spite of being an ardent mountain hiker, I had never seen a grizzly. I knew they were out there in the woods or up in the alpine meadows, but the grizzlies were very good at avoiding us. I was a 20-year-old student employed for the summer at the Jasper Park Lodge. While in Jasper, I was also a member of a lush folk singing group. Yeah, and one evening in early September found me hiking from the lodge to Trefoil Lake, lugging my banjo to a paid gig. I had to hurry, so I was looking for a shortcut through the woods. A horse wrangler near the trailhead recommended a route to the lake. Keep to the left was his primary piece of advice. Whenever you find a fork in the trail, always take the left one, except the place where there's 3 forks, then you go right a fair piece and then left again. I nodded to him as though I were gathering in every detail. It seemed like the polite thing to do. If you run into a lot of junk on the trail, he said, you've gone too far. You're in the dump. Don't go near that dump. Not now. Not in the evening. And by the Jesus, you know why. Yes, I told him I knew why. As the light began to fade, I found a discarded license plate lying on the trail. Then a discarded muffler. Then a rusted out car engine. Oops. The fork I had chosen must have been the wrong one. It led to a meadow at the upper edge of the dump. This meant that the danger lay below the edge, right? I entered a clover meadow embraced on 3 sides by pine trees, and much to my relief, saddle horses were munching on the clover. My banjo seemed to have gone heavier in its case, but I continued past the first group of horses and spotted what appeared to be an exit from the dump. I also saw, however dimly, a second gathering of horses foraging not far from this exit. Anyone who knew anything about horses and bears knew that the two would not hang out together, browsing the same meadow. Knowing that I was safe, I charged straight for the exit gate. A very loud male voice began to yell. The man seemed, for some reason, to be cursing at me. "What the hell are you doing?" the voice roared. Through the fading light, I made out the figure of a wrangler on horseback. "Just heading for the exit," I yelled back to him. "What?" he cried, incredulous. "Over there by those horses," I said, pointing at the five at the gate. "What horses?" he said. I looked again, squinting in the fading light. Oh shit. They weren't horses. All five had paused from their grazing and were observing me with some alarm. The biggest grizzly of the bunch began to approach me in a pigeon-toed sort of trot. I trotted in the direction of the wrangler, who was parked on his horse beside a different exit I hadn't noticed. "Want to climb up?" he said. No, I told him my banjo was too heavy. So he turned his horse and began a slow canter away from the dump through the woods. Lugging my banjo, I cantered after him, and soon I was safe. Had this wrangler not intervened, I might have been mauled that night, and five bewildered grizzlies would have been shot by the warden service. I carried that image of the five grizzlies the rest of the way to my gig at Trefoil Lake, and later into the Jasper Blues pub, where lodge employees like to gather after work. And I brought that image of my first five grizzlies all the way to this desk, where 60 years later, I write these words, still in awe of those bears, and still groaning at my youthful stupidity. One last reflection. When I arrived after my gig that night at the pub, I was determined not to tell anyone of my foolish dalliance with death. A young fellow who seemed to know some of my friends joined us at our table and ordered a beer. He said, "Did you guys hear about the idiot at the dump tonight?" We all leaned forward. Idiot plus dusk plus garbage dump equals disaster. "Apparently," said this new arrival, "some tourist came to the dump tonight to serenade the grizzlies. Drunk as a skunk. He had a frickin' guitar. Ripley's, I swear he had a frickin' guitar. Bunch of cowboys had to rescue him." I mentioned this coda to my foolish adventure because it exemplifies Grizzly's capacity for inspiring exaggeration, legend, and myth. Even more than black bears, grizzlies amble through our consciousness with mythic power. Thank you. I'm going to stop now and take my medicine from the interrogator behind me. So listen. This on? Not yours.
Everybody hear me okay? So, David, do you recognize any of those bears in the crowd here?
Very few of my friends wear bearskins to scare them, but it works every time.
So I want you to know that I would never, on my own, ask you a question like this. But you suggested I ask you this question, and it seems like a good way to begin. Why focus on your own foolishness in this book?
I just focus on things that I'm good at. I think there might be a serious answer to your question. In this book, you see an awful lot of examples of me at my most foolish, and not just in my youth, but mostly in my youth. And it seems to me that the learning process has been a very steep one for me. And I've probably learned as much from my mistakes and my stupidity than from all the books I've read to write this book. I guess it's a naive traveler's guide or something like that. But I was a city boy and I knew nothing about these animals when I first saw them. And I was so stricken by them that they stayed with me into my late 50s, as I am now.
Dave and I belong to a writing group, along with Dwayne Brenna and the late Don Kerr. And as Dave was writing these essays, we got to read them sort of on the go. We meet once a month or so. And one of the things that all three of us, Dwayne and Don and I, agreed on was that these stories are as much about you as they are about the wildlife that you encounter. Although there is an awful lot of information in these essays. How did that come about? Did you have that in mind when you started, or did it just gradually emerge?
Well, an early temptation might have been to write this story all about intrepid Dave and his nifty pepper spray as he lurches through the woods. It's sort of like telling a story about all the big fish you've caught, or this moose that you shot and photographed yourself with your boot on its head. What's your foregrounding in those narratives is your ego. I don't think you could make a good story out of your heroic exploits. Not that I have any, but and now I've successfully forgotten the question.
Well, that's okay, because in your stumbling attempt to answer, you hit upon something that I think is the secret of this book. And that's the word story. This is a wildlife book, but it's not a book about wildlife. It's a book filled with stories about your encounters with wildlife. And that's what gives it its charm, I think. And so again, I come back to my original question. Is that what you had in mind, or did you just sort of stumble into it?
I think what I had in mind towards the end of that series of stories was that I wanted the book to be about the relationship between me and the animals, and I wanted to give the animals a lot of attention. I want to give them attention because one of the reasons is that especially the apex predators that we still have on this continent, they're disappearing very quickly. The polar bears, the grizzlies, certainly the cougars, and the wolves are frequently in great danger of disappearing. Certainly the rattlesnakes in Western Canada are down to very low numbers, and I think it's a tragedy. I have come in some strange way to love these scary animals, love them in a very real way. And I would hope that I could pass some of that love on to the people who read the book, and also the need to protect wilderness habitat and to protect these precious animals. There was a time when there were dinosaurs on this earth, and a cosmic event made them disappear very quickly. And during that extinction, some of their bodies got preserved in various ways. And now in this century, we make movies about them, we write books about them, we put them in museums, we make toys out of them. We make cartoon characters out of them, as though there's something in our brain that misses the dinosaurs. Well, think about what it'll be like when the last of our apex predators disappear and the forests have no bears in them anymore. I think we are lessened as a species if we keep determinedly killing these animals, killing off these animals. So I guess underneath the humor of the book is a serious intention.
Do you think there's any hope for survival of these animals?
Well, in conversations like the one we're having, whoopsie, we throw glasses at each other. There's a lot of despair. There's a lot of despair in conversations about global warming, and there's a lot of apocalyptic narratives out there, and I think there are ways of doing something about the disappearance of these animals, about the disappearance of their habitats, and about global warming. And I don't think any of us thinks in terms of saving the world. We are only one person. We do a better job when we're united in this cause. And there are practical, joyful things we can do to militate against the destruction of, say, trees in our province. And there are some solutions in the book that I offer that people can work with. One example just popped into my head. There used to be a program on maybe the Nature Channel, set in British Columbia. A group of women who love bear cubs rescue the bear cubs. They teach the bears how to be independent. They feed the bears and they grow up healthy. And then they take them to a release point and release them into the wild. They take very good care of these bears, and they make sure the bears are not habituated, but rather more independent and habituated. That's just one small thing they are doing for bears, and there's so much love in that operation. That's why I say when you do something to save the planet, it can be a very joyful experience, not just a duty.
So have you been tempted to adopt a bear?
I just checked the law. If you're over 80, you can't do that. I would have, you know.
I see, and anyway, they probably wouldn't get along with the rattlesnakes in your backyard.
No. Anyway, they're not in my backyard tonight. They're in that cardboard box.
So in the selections that you read from, we met hungry mosquitoes that were attacking you, and a dragonfly who befriended you. Both voracious predators, both the mosquitoes and the dragonflies. And then you came face to face with a couple of rattlesnakes, and then you came pretty much face to face with some grizzly bears. And yet you profess that you want people to learn to love these animals.
I do.
How are we going to come to love these animals when you point out how scary they are?
That's a very good question. Very good question. One of the reasons that I love these animals is that they're beautiful and magnificent. And when you're going down a trail and you see a grizzly stand up, as they sometimes do to get a better view of you, sure, the first impulse is fear, but there's something else going on there that approaches a state of reverence. These are amazing animals to look at. Their grace and their power and their the sense in which they belong in this habitat. And when I studied literature a long time ago, there was this theory of the numinous. In primitive tribal society, if you saw a numen, which would be a local deity, you felt fear and reverence. Now, I guess there's quite a bit of difference because we'll be carrying pepper spray. But if those animals are lost to us, those magnificent animals are lost to us, so is the numinous experience you get from coming close to an animal like that. And believe me, I've got lots of stats in this book that will prove this. It's a very rare occasion when one of these animals kills a human being. It's almost impossibly rare.
Well, that raises a question. Do you ever worry that the great enthusiasm you bring in this book to these scary, predaceous creatures and your encounter and your accounts of your own misadventures with them, you ever worry that this might lead some foolhardy reader, me for example, to a horrible death?
When you say that, I feel such power. I've urged people who walk in the cougar country not to walk alone, and I have various things you can do to keep safe from bears, especially if you have food around. I mean, there are things you can do, and the chances of being attacked by one of these animals is very rare. Read an article on Star Phoenix a long time ago, well, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, and also it was in the Regina Leader Post, and its headline was, "Southwestern Saskatchewan has a cougar problem." And it talked about how dangerous these animals were. There's not a single record of a death by cougar in Saskatchewan. There's not a single record of an attack by a cougar in Saskatchewan. We've got problems with
Politicians.
yeah.
And writers.
We have mental health, taking care of mental health. We've got people who can't drink their own water. We've got one of the highest crime rates in the country. I could list a dozen problems that are real problems because people die from these problems and families are affected by them. We don't have a cougar problem, even though cougars are scary. And we don't have a rattlesnake problem. There's never been a rattlesnake death in Saskatchewan, even though they're scary. I love the fact that they're scary. I love the fact that they can have such an emotional impact on me when I see them.
Well, I take your point, and I agree that we're in pretty safe territory in Saskatchewan, but I used to be a newspaper reporter in Alberta, as you know, and I personally have written half a dozen stories, maybe, about people attacked by bears or cougars. So it certainly still happens.
Yeah, it does.
Particularly in mountainous areas like Alberta.
In
British Columbia.
in British Columbia, there have been several deaths from grizzly attacks over the past 30, 40 years. But people, mostly wealthy hunters, have managed to kill approximately, I think it's something like 1,300 grizzlies per year.
Wow.
And You could probably tell whose side I'm on.
So what do you think about the politicians who allow that to happen?
Well, I'm impressed by the fact that in Alberta, the grizzly hunt is over. And in BC, it's either completely over or quite restricted. But people in BC are very nature conscious. You can still hunt caribou and legally in northern Manitoba. I don't know why, it's a stupid rule. You can still shoot polar bears in the far north. And I think that's a stupid license as well. But politicians, the politician who headed up a committee to study the cougar problem was our Minister of the Environment. And he said, from now on, any conservation officer can call what he calls a houndsman to scare off the cougars. Well, these houndsmen are guys who have traps and dogs, and they trap the cougars and shoot them. And they've shot hundreds in this province. They don't scare them away. And you might even guess who that environment minister was 10 years ago.
Anybody hazard a guess?
Well, his job as premier now, I forget his name. But I get a little fanatical on this subject, I must admit.
That same minister has also declared open season on liberals. So since we're talking about violent death, let's turn our attention to fish. You wrote an eloquent book about why you gave up hunting, but you still fish. And torture
He
them,
looked nervously at his shoes.
torture them and kill them. Of course, we eat them, so it's not just for sport. But how do you justify that?
Well, I can't. I haven't found a way of justifying that. All I know is that that the choice you have as a fly fisherman, it is either to torture the trout and release it or kill it and eat it. But we're better than hunters because they haven't invented a way of catch and release for hunters. But I can see that when I was hunting, as soon as I started thinking about the birds that I shot and how some of them didn't die right away, it started to bother me more and more. And hunters are not supposed to think that way. If it happens that I start to worry about fishing that way, I guess I'll quit. But in the meantime, I think for the next 20 years, I'll probably keep on.
I want to ask just one more question, and then I will ask if people in the audience have any questions. But I know that you wrote this book in just the 2 or so years of the COVID pandemic. But I also know that most of your other books took you a lot longer to write. Some of them many years. Why did this one come so quickly?
Well, there were all these entries in my notebooks, and I didn't write them down straight into the manuscript, but they made me realize that I had already written this book in my head. Every time I had a memory of, say, seeing a coyote, I would get another memory, coyote. Every time I had a memory of encountering a wolf, I remembered other encounters. And it's just this book, some books are, even though I did a lot of research, especially on the science side of this book, I did a lot of science reading. It was already, all of it was there in my head. Just, I was like a stenographer. I took dictation.
Dictation. So are there any questions out there? for our esteemed author.
or challenges from the floor? D,
Let's talk about snakes.
okay,
All right, so I'm afraid of snakes. So, but I'm curious about human beings in the world of agriculture and specifically the diamondback rattler in British Columbia, like in the area around Oliver. There's desert, but there's also vineyards. And for years, I wore a T-shirt from one of my favorite vineyards that had a diamondback rattler on it. So, do you know, are there still rattlers in and around Soyuz and Oliver and the Smoking Valley, or has all that?
yeah, there are, yeah, there,
Hasn't chased them away yet.
they're a West Coast variety of rattler. They're fairly small, although they're a little bigger than prairie rattlers that we get here. And there's never been any diamondback rattlers. They're very much a southwestern snake, Texas and well, there's about 4 or 5 southwestern states where you can still find them.
There are still rattlers.
Yeah, there's still are rattlers, and now they're protected. And you know what BC people are like when they're protecting species. They're northern. There's a small population of them in the southern Okanagan. In Saskatchewan, there's a tiny pocket near grasslands, and another pocket of rattlers that live on the South Saskatchewan River Valley and moves into Alberta, comes from Alberta. There's a tiny pocket in Alberta where there's rattlers. And around there, often the people who drive trucks on these side roads deliberately run over them. And it really drives me crazy. But they too are being more protected now than they have been. There's been 2 deaths in Ontario from Massasauga rattlesnakes in a whole century. 2 deaths. 1 in BC, and that's it. That's the deaths that are caused by rattlesnake bites.
Any other questions?
Well, I have another one.
Yes,
Let's talk about bears.
yes.
Grizzlies. So I lived in Calgary for a long time, and I had friends that were carpool when my kids were small. So just about 15 years ago, a woman who was one of our carpoolers committed suicide because 20 years prior, she and her husband had both been mauled by a grizzly in a hiking spot. And she lost an eye, and her face was mauled, and her husband's back was mauled. He was a doctor.
I read about that.
And she had a pair of twins, one of whom was on the spectrum, and an older child as well. And when they turned 18, when her youngest kids turned 18, she committed suicide because the pain that her body had been inflicted on her body by this attack was, well, she tolerated it because she had children, right? So I heard you say, maybe I heard you say, what did you say about deaths due to grizzlies? I mean,
Well, the parks themselves have statistics on bear attacks. And the chances of, in one park, the one in Wyoming, Yellowstone, yeah, in Yellowstone, the chances of you not just seeing a grizzly, there's lots of them there, but being severely attacked by one are, I think, something like 1 in 900,000. And well, I think the bears are very territorial, and if you walk into their territory,
with the banjo on your back.
that's a killer. That's
They're attracted.
bears have good taste. They don't like banjos. And so it might be that they're really alarmed. They know we are the enemy. We are the most predacious creature on the planet. They know that in some strange way. And so suddenly the enemy appears. The reaction is is to beat the hell out of this person. Sometimes the people die. Rarely does a grizzly eat a human victim. Rarely does a black bear eat its victim. Yeah. Very rarely is this for food. It's usually just a violent reaction from a really disturbed animal.
Have you spent much time with polar bears?
No, I haven't. Almost every animal in this book I've had engagements with, but no, not with polar bears. And they are the most endangered of the apex predators. Have you ever seen them? Where? Oh, lucky you.
They just wandered the streets.
They do, but they rarely attack people like that.
Yeah, not in the town, because they move them out and they're more to get to the dump.
Yeah.
What's there?
There was a polar bear death this past year in Norway, in an island in the very northern part of Norway. And once in a while, you will hear, maybe once a decade, that polar bear. They are certainly dangerous, but it's worth whatever we can do to keep them living.
Anybody else?
It's, I've heard recently that, a lot of wild animals, looking for food, they're attracted to and end up ingesting plastic. Because there's a lot of food out there around. So, and I understand it's causing changes to their systems. I'm just wondering if you run across that in research.
I've read a little bit about it. I hear more stories about, and if we're talking about polar bears in grave danger, because their hunting ground has always been the ice, and the ice is retreating, and their hunting season is retreating therefore, and they have to come on land and scrounge what they can find, and that's often when they run into trouble.
Well, I think I will close this off by saying that this is a terrific book. David. Thank you for writing it. What are your hopes for it?
I hope the book reaches an audience. I hope the book connects with people who have a soft spot for animals. And I hope that I see myself as a sort of buck private in the army of conservation.
Well, Buck Private, I salute you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again to David Carpenter, Dave Margoshes, and everyone at Thistledown Press. Huge thanks to everyone who attended tonight's launch in person or virtually. I believe Dave will stick around to sign some books. Of course, we've got copies of I Never Met a Rattlesnake available for purchase in that stack right over there. You're welcome to get your copy signed before you purchase it. Just be sure to stop the cash desk on your way out. And thank you so much for joining us again. Have a wonderful evening.
It really is a rattlesnake in that bag, and if you don't pay for your book, you'll find out about it.